Hey, welcome back. This is Joel Duff, and thanks for joining me on this little excursion into the deep into the woods of young Earth creationist literature. And so I'm just here to talk about this paper, which I just saw posted on the Creation Ministries International website. And so this could have been part of This Week in Creationism, but I just wanted to talk about just this paper. I couldn't believe that I have missed this one. Actually, I guess I can believe it. I don't have a subscription to the Journal of Creation anymore. I just not willing to pay the money to a Young Earth Creationist organization or to get the most up-to-date stuff in this case. So finally, this 2021 paper has been released, from publication and put on their website. And I immediately knew upon looking at just a little bit of it that this was actually a very significant paper and fascinating given Ken Ham's recent fixation on what he worries about is this young earth evolution movement going on within young earth creationism. And this is only going to add fuel to the fire, this particular paper. Um, and so, what is this paper about? It's about bareminology. All right, I just scared away like 90% of you. Like bareminology, it's, you know, what are you talking about? If you don't know what that is. And even if you do know what it is, you're like, why is that really important? I hope to explain how this paper fits into the general direction of young Earth creationism and their attempt to understand the diversity of life on this Earth, and most importantly, where that diversity came from. And that's what Jean Leitner has been working on for many years. She's an independent researcher. She's not employed by any major ministry. She did do a lot of work, um, work outside of Answers in Genesis, but had sort of been conscripted to do a lot of the work for the Ark Encounter to try to determine what the different kinds were. So she wrote a number of articles about like what are all the different mammal kinds and so forth. And these were really important papers for sort of establishing what Answers in Genesis sort of believes as sort of position papers on how to explain the kinds that are on the Ark. Kind of goes toward there's a big plaque on the wall in the Ark Encounter that actually lists like all the different kinds that Noah would have brought on board. Well, now that I've read this particular paper by Jean Leitner, which is notably published in the Journal of Creation, not Answers Research Journal, which is Answers in Genesis Journal. This is Creation Ministries International's scientific journal. And what's interesting about it is when I read this paper, I think that she's having some different thoughts about the definition of a kind and the breadth of what a kind can be. And this is a very provocative article. And so I want to I'm going to read portions of it for you. I know that this text is kind of small depending on what kind of format you're watching this on. And so I'll be highlighting some sections and I'll read it for you. And I'm really going to here to discuss like why this paper is important. I'm going to decipher, the complexity of this paper into hopefully a simple description of why and how this fits into the world of young Earth creation or young Earth biology. Um, okay, so let me just give away the story right from the get-go. Right, let me give you the important highlights, and then I can back up and explain like how she gets to those this particular view, which I think is, it's not completely novel, but nonetheless, she's really putting it out there for me for one of the first times I've seen it this directly. Like, okay, get to the point, Duff. What are you talking about? We're talking about the question of, are the created kinds, the things that God made in the first 6 days, the kinds of things, all right, that he made on earth, are they the same things as the ark kinds? The ark kinds would be the kinds of organisms that Noah brought onto the ark. So did God create a canine kind? Because Ken Ham likes to talk about, like, say, dogs, right? Canines. And that there was a canine kind that God created. And then on the ark, what did Noah do? Noah had to preserve two canines representing that kind. And then those two canines got off the ark 4,350 years ago. And they then diversified into all the members of the family that we see today, like 35 different species of canines that would have come from just two. Then, well, that's assuming that the canine kind is the kind that God created and is also an arc kind. What Jean Leitner is going to do here is she's going to suggest that there isn't the Bible is not clear enough for us to be able to be sure that the created kinds and the arc kinds are identical to one another. That the meaning of mean, of kind, is not different in those two places, or at least that our way of the way we have traditionally, or young Earth creationists have traditionally defined mean as a kind, needs to be revisited. All right, what are the implications of this? Let's just scroll down to the conclusion here, and I'll read that for you. In summary, this little section here. In summary, it cannot be supported linguistically that the kinds Noah took on the ark have a one-to-one correspondence to the kinds God created in Genesis 1. She thinks, based on what's in this article, and I'm not going to go over the nitty-gritty of the Hebrew and so forth in this paper, but she's going to make an argument which I actually think has a lot of merit. That linguistically, you can't say for sure that the kinds that Noah brought on board are the same kinds that God made at the beginning. All right, there's not a one-to-one correspondence. Given the years, and here's her other rationale. And then, so if we can't be sure exactly whether these kinds are referring to the same thing, we can look at other observations. And for her, the other observation is that there are 1,600 years between the creation and the flood. And look what happened after the flood. After the flood, you had a kind which then diversified into sometimes hundreds of species. For Jean Leitner, she has some kinds that have diversified into as many as 1,000 different species within just the last 4,500 years. Right? So incredible radiation and diversification. And so logically, she also asks the question, well, what about the kinds originally created by God, which would have been full of genetic diversity? That's another mainstay of answers in Genesis, is that the original kinds were like packed full of genetic diversity. And that would allow them then to expand and radiate and diversify by simply reshuffling their genetic diversity and become a bunch of different species. So it follows that Jean Leitner's logic follows that, okay, well, what about after the creation, before the flood? If these organisms had been created maybe in one portion of the world and then said to go out and fill the world, right, from the garden or the immediate vicinity of the garden, then these kinds would have reproduced, right, to fill the world. And as they moved out across this world before the flood, they would have encountered different environments, and they would have diversified, speciated into those different environments, creating a whole bunch of different sorts and types within each kind. Now, here's the big thing. Leitner's going to say that by the time you get to Noah's flood, and Noah is commanded to bring 2 of every kind of animal on the ark, those kinds represent things that are, the generic sort of, the kind is not a taxonomically specific term like we would use in the scientific realm to identify, like, say, species and families. It's more of a gestalt type, like I look at organisms around me and I can see that this is a different kind than this, right? And kind then doesn't mean like these things are reproducing after their own kind. So here, let me give you a specific example. So let's say you had an original canine kind. And that canine kind diversified into 2 major groups, foxes and the wolf type canines, right? Which are 2 major lineages within the canines. And then and this all happened in the first 1,600 years, right? So the flood's coming about, and Noah's been commanded to bring 2 of every kind on the ark. And Noah looks out there and he says, like, there's foxes, right? In my world, I see foxes and they're reproducing after their own kind, and I see wolves and they're reproducing after their own kind, and foxes and wolves aren't mixing, and so forth. And to Noah at that point, then, those represent two kinds of organisms that are important to the ecology of the world of that time. And they represent, in the same sense, the original kind, which was one type of thing, that has now become two types of things that are as different from each other as the original kinds were from one another, right? As dogs were, or canines were from cats originally. So what does that mean? What did Noah do then? What is Leitner suggesting here? Leitner is going to suggest in this paper that Noah's kinds, right, represent essentially subgroups of the original kind that now he understands to be kinds, and therefore he's going to bring two foxes and two wolf-like creatures on the ark. And then they're going to depart from the ark, and they will further speciate after the ark into the variety of different species of foxes and variety of species of wolves. Now, this is a really interesting twist because it allows for some of the variation or some of the creation or formation of different subgroups within a kind to have occurred before the flood. And then Noah is able to capture that variation on the ark because he's taking on multiple members of an original kind are on the ark. Now, to most creationists and most people, and certainly Ken Ham and others who have had a very simplistic reading of the text in which they just immediately jump to the conclusion that, oh, there's words used in Genesis, and then this word is used in Genesis 6 for Noah, that he should bring, there's a kind created in Genesis, and then he's supposed to bring representatives of the kinds on the ark. Therefore, there must be a one-to-one relationship. Well, in that case, if there's a canine kind, he can only bring two individuals of that canine kind on the ark. But if Leitner's right, and that kind doesn't have this strict boundary in terms of I don't know how to put. We'll get to her. Let's get to her language about this because she explains as well. I'm just having trouble remembering exactly how she distinguishes these two different terms, kind. But if kind is the normal sense of a person viewing the world and identifying the kinds of things around them, right? Noah's going to see different kinds than maybe the original creation had, and therefore protect and save those kinds in different ways. This has huge ramifications in the interpretation of the fossil record for young Earth creationists, the rate at which species can form, and although Gene Leitner doesn't go this direction exactly in her paper, you can clearly read into this something that I think Ken Ham's not going to appreciate, which is this allows for a lot more young Earth evolution, potentially a lot more. So for example, let me just be as provocative as possible right from the get-go here, because this is the way I see this going. I mean, what is to say this couldn't have happened even within a young Earth creationist view? That God created a carnivore kind, right? That was in the original creation, he created a carnivore kind. And this carnivore kind had all this genetic potential to become different kinds of carnivores. And so after Adam's sin, you have the diversification of this original carnivore kind, and it diversifies into a bunch of different species before the flood. And some of those are cat-like, and some are bear-like, and some are wolf-like, okay? And some are hyena-like. And so you have these different kinds of carnivores, right? They've changed enough that they have become their own like gives rise to like, right? They've split into different groups, that original carnivore into different groups, each of which has its own unique characteristics, which are easily identifiable by the individuals living at that time. And they see that hyenas give rise to more hyenas, cats give rise to cats, canines give rise to more canines, like begets like. Those are now kinds, right? In the same way that the original kind was an organism that gives rise to similar organisms like itself. And so what happens is that you have an original carnivore kind, and then you have 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, different carnivore kinds that are now exist in Noah's world. And Noah then takes on representatives of all those different carnivore kinds, because now there's multiple kinds of carnivores. And then after the flood, they diversify anymore. So maybe the canine kind is represented by 2 individuals, just like Ken Ham would say. And then after the flood, they diversify into 35 different species of canines, including foxes and the wolf types. Now, in this way of thinking, you could say that today there's actually 2 different canine kinds. There's fox types canine kinds, and there's wolf-like canine kinds, because they have changed enough that you can see that there's a whole bunch of different kinds of foxes, and they're all similar to each other. They give rise to more foxes. And then there's a bunch of wolf-type canines, and they're similar to each other, and they give rise to more wolf-like canines. And so it might not be inappropriate to say that there are actually 2 different canine kinds today, in the very sense, in a biblical Hebrew sense of the word kind, what it originally meant. Now, do you see what's happening here? If Gene Leitner is correct, and that kinds, the original kind, could become multiple kinds, right? In the perspective and the viewpoint of a person later in time, and now 4,000 years later, we can have additional kinds. That means one kind can become 2 kinds. Okay, it's like, it's like, you see how I think that Ken Ham's not going to appreciate this particular perspective, on reading Genesis and the definition of kind, and what bareminology should include. Kinds can become other kinds. Now, of course, Gene Leitner is not going to say that all life has a common ancestor. She's still going to say there's an original, right, created kind. And that's the thing that we need to try to flesh out and discover what it is. And that's really hard to do because, as she points out, it's hard to do because there's not that many clues about exactly what the definition or of the boundaries are of the original kinds. But nonetheless, she definitely believes that there are distinct different kinds that God created, that because everything was created in just a couple days, and so these are the things that were created in the world. But she is really providing an allowance for an immense amount of diversity coming from those original kinds, such that today we have many, many, many more kinds than were in the present world, although they're all descendants of those original kinds. So kinds can become kinds. Kinds can beget other kinds, in other words. So you see how, if that's true, then you can have an immense amount of evolution occurring within the young Earth creationist framework, far more than Ken Ham is allowing, and even more than even most of what Ken Ham calls the young Earth evolutionist, which he's complaining about, is saying that they're pushing the limits too far. Well, Gene Leitner has just broken wide open and provided the possibility of tremendous amounts of common ancestry, and even one kind becoming another kind, which if there's anything that Ken Ham loves to say, is just like, one kind can't become another kind, right? Kinds were created and they have limits, and no kind has ever been observed to ever become another kind of organism. But in this sense, I think that I could say that Gene Leitner can't eliminate the possibility based on her description here and what she has, how she has worked this out about what the limits are of a kind, or the lack of limits of a kind. She cannot argue completely, from the text, from the Bible, that cats and dogs don't have a common ancestor. That they are, in fact, an original, cats and dogs are part of the same original created kind. She might be able to say that they are different ark kinds, that they were different by the time you get to the ark. And so those are ark kinds, but they actually do share a common ancestor in the past. So that's why this particular article is really fascinating. And I've given away most of the big portion of the story of this, but let's go through a few of the details. let's go back to like what bareminology is. Um, and hit sort of the highlights here, and then we'll talk about what are the there are other ramifications for young Earth creationism. I actually think she solves a really, really difficult problem that young Earth creationists have with the post-flood boundary, and she provides a very unique solution to a very serious problem for institutes for creation research. So I'll touch upon that as well. So let me read you a good portion of the abstract, because it'll give you an idea if you don't even know what I'm talking about. Of course, if you don't know what I'm talking about, you're probably not listening at this point on the video, but because you're like, this is just totally nutty stuff. Um, but let me read the first part because it'll give you a sense for what the science of bareminology is. All right. The science of bareminology is based on the understanding of that the biblical phrase appearing in the creation account and later text, according to their kinds, right? That's the phrase we're talking about, according to their kinds, conveys important information for an accurate understanding of natural history, right? The Bible talks about kinds, talks about creating kinds, and kinds are created after their own kind. And since that's the authority by which we understand the nature of the world, then that's going to be important to understand what that means in order to understand natural history, the history of the world. Bareminologists, those who study created kinds and what they can do and can't do, attempt to identify which creatures are related in that they're descended from the same created kind. So a bareminologist has to figure out, hey, I've got these two species or two individuals. I mean, it's pretty easy two individuals in a population. I can see that they have a common ancestor. But these two populations of foxes here and population of fox over there, maybe those populations are descendants of a prior population in which there was a previous population that included members of both, and they've over time have separated themselves, but they share a common ancestor, a common gene pool, we'll say. But maybe those populations, there's other populations, and they're also share a common ancestor, and we call all those a species. But then there's this other, that's the red fox. But then there's the gray fox, all right? And there's the kit fox. And if I look at those populations of those organisms, I can see they share common ancestry. And then in those species, I could also infer share common ancestry. And that's because I think they're all part of the same created kind, right? So as long as individual species are parts of the same kind, they're allowed to share common ancestry. In fact, they must share common ancestry. But at some point, I'm going to say that there's a different kind, and therefore they can't share a common ancestor. But I had to figure out how do I figure out when I look at two different species, do they share a common ancestor or not? Because in the young Earth creationist world, two species might share a common ancestor, and two other species might not share a common ancestor. And there has to be some criteria for being able to distinguish those two different things, those two different scenarios. This information can be used to infer other historical details within the creation model. Oh yeah, I mean, you've got a lot of other things dependent upon this. Like when you look at, if you want to figure out what was on Noah's flood, how many animals did Noah have to have on the ark? If you want to provide some ballpark figure for that particular question, which lots of people have been interested in, you have to know what a kind is, right? Because if the kinds are on Noah's ark, you have to know what a kind is and know what he brought on the ark. It's just absolutely critical for that. All right. This includes details from genetics, such as genomic variability at the time of the flood, to geology, paleontology, such as the post-flood flood boundary. These are all things she's saying are going to be affected by your understanding of kinds. How much genetic diversity is there in a kind? Well, if you think a kind is all carnivores, then the original kind had to include genetic diversity of all carnivores combined into the package of one set of organisms that was the original carnivore kind. If it was just canines, then you don't have to have as much genetic diversity in your original ancestor, because canines don't have as much genetic diversity as the total package of all carnivores. And so understanding the actual observed genetic diversity of today's species and organisms and families and so forth has to be understood within the context of the world of where organisms came from in the creationist world. So if a kind is a family, then you have to explain the genetic diversity of the entire family within the context of just 6,000 years. But if a kind is only a genus, then you don't have as much genetic diversity in a genus, and you need to describe that amount of genetic diversity within the context of a 6,000-year-old world with a global flood, bottleneck, and all that. What if a kind is all carnivores? Well, then you have to explain all that genetic diversity within the context of 6,000 years ago, a bottleneck, but maybe that bottleneck included the passing through of multiple different members of that kind because they are now multiple kinds, right? So all these questions that are for which there's been ink spilt on thousands of pages in the young Earth creationist literature actually depends on the definition of a kind, and the definition of kind is amazingly squishy. it's like very difficult to define. And that's been one of the hardest things for young Earth creationists. It's like the most important thing, and yet it has been very difficult to come up with any consensus view among young Earth creationists as to what a kind is. All right, so as it says, a key issue is understanding the kinds mentioned in Genesis 1 creation account, and whether they're identical to those mentioned in Genesis 6 and 7 in the flood account. Here, a review of the underlying Hebrew word translated kind suggests that they are not necessarily identical, and caution should be used in inferences made about the kinds of animals on Noah's Ark. If she is right, that busts open a whole bunch of different stuff in young Earth creationism, and it renders moot like a ton of stuff that a lot of other people have done to try to that has assumed a constriction at Noah's flood for the amount of genetic diversity that could have gotten through. And so there's a lot of people who will have to rethink their genetics, and a lot of people are going to have to rethink their understanding of the fossil record as well if she's correct that a kind in the original creation could be multiple different kinds at the time of Noah's flood. We're not going to, trust me, we're not going to read this whole paper. I'm going to read a section here, and then we're going to go toward the end. We're going to look at the implications of it. Bareminology is a study of created kinds. The term is derived from the Hebrew word bara, which means created, and min, which is kind. So putting together created and kind together to make this word. And this paragraph here just talks about how, hey, creationists have been interested in like exactly what is this kind, because you have a word for it. You have this word kind, but then when it's described in multiple different locations in the text, sometimes there are individual, like what appears to be specific species that are referenced when referencing, and sometimes it's just like birds. So sometimes it seems so generic, and other times it's incredibly narrow. And so what exactly is this kind thing? How do we define it, and how does that correlate to our modern scientific taxonomy? And her conclusion, and really the conclusion of really all scholars, is that there really isn't a one-to-one comparison of like a strict scientific definition of kind. You can't take what we understand to be a species or a family and directly import it into the biblical sense of what a kind is. She's talking about how, as scientists, it's easy to see things in taxonomic terms. Yet, studies of the Hebrew word mean, as it is used in various biblical passages, have repeatedly warned that the word is unlikely to carry the taxonomic significance that the word baramin implies. Then she goes on to talk about Williams, who did this analysis of mean from the Old Testament and so forth. He suggests that the word is likely of biological origin, has the basic meaning of division, but division of what and how divided? That the world is divided up into parts called these kinds, but what exactly are they? Caution is warranted, right? Later, a decade later, Turner revisited the topic. I've read both of these papers. By the way, I highly suggest you read Turner's paper, Kenneth Turner's paper. It's a really, really interesting analysis, and I think very thorough analysis of the word kind. He wrote this in a young Earth creationist journal, but notably, I would just note that since he wrote that paper, he's no longer a young Earth creationist, but he still has like one of the most important papers on the definition of a kind out there. Over a decade later, Turner revisits the topic, again attempting to address the significance of mean in Scripture as it relates to the interest of creation biologists. And that's specifically was interested in the meaning of mean from the perspective of how this will influence, how does this influence how we think about biology and how we think about topics like the topic of evolution. He has many similar conclusions, namely that in Scripture, mean plausibly refers to biological subdivision, and that it most likely refers to a general observable category, a lot like the English kind. Both Williams and Turner should be read in their entirety if anyone interested in the subject. I agree. You really do need to read those papers if you want to understand the biblical limits of this word kind. In this paper, we want to build on the foundational works, these foundational works, and ask some deeper questions. We want to know if the kind of terrestrial and flying creatures created in Genesis 1 were the same as those taken on the ark. Right? To do this, it's useful to see how the word mean is used in Scripture, revisiting some of those points that have been previously made. All right, but she's specifically going to talk about flying creatures and try to determine whether there are, how broad that category is, and what the limits of a kind could be there. All right, so now I'm going to skip down a bunch of stuff. She's talking about the basic pattern of a kind. Then she goes through the creation account, specifically identifies all the different ways that the word kind is used there. And then basically she has like, here's the text, here's the actual Hebrew, and then here's like what we usually take from that as the meaning, and shows how there's a bunch of diversity of ways of thinking, even within Genesis 1 and Genesis 3, or yeah, Genesis 1 mostly. That kind has kind of a very broad meaning there. And then she goes into the text in Genesis 6, all right, when God's talking to Noah and telling him to bring the kinds on board. And that's where she gets to, like, this is really, it's using the same word after your own kind. But is there this sense that this is not a strict, like, this has a very a literal meaning in the sense that you know what the kinds were. It's more like, you're looking at this world and you're able to identify this generic thing that we call things that are like things, right? things that you have observed, right, in your world to give rise to the same type of thing consistently. And by the time Noah's around, maybe those things are actually groups of organisms that are now different from one another, different enough from one another that no one would recognize those as easily identifiable, distinguishable things, right? If, some of the kinds, right? So if Noah had seen an orangutan and a gorilla, would he just automatically think that those are the same kind? Probably not, right? He's saying like the normal sense of that is that anybody, a child, can look at those two different things and say like, those are two different kinds of organisms, right? They behave differently, they look different, and all that. And then if you got even into the scientific stuff, you like they can't reproduce with one another, and there's all this other stuff that suggests they're really different from one another, right? They're different kinds. Like that's just anyone's easy observation that they're different kinds. But now remember, Ken Ham says that orangutans and apes or gorillas are the same kind, like the same created kind. And Noah only had to bring 2 of the great apes on the ark. And then they changed into the different things that we see today, which to our eyes certainly look like different kinds, right? But he's going to say they're all part of the same kind. Yeah, so he's trying to maintain some kind of scientific distinction about like, okay, they share a common ancestor, so therefore they're the same kind, even though from a sort of observational sense and from a normal average person sense, right, which I think is what God, and this is what she's really pointing out here. That's the language God is communicating through Moses or to Adam, is these things that I've created that are different from one another that you can observe as things like these are things that are things I made that are like one another. Um, that is what Noah's looking at the world saying, like, these are things that God has made that are different from it. Those are kinds for me. Doesn't matter that they actually have a common ancestor, that God made those four different kinds that Noah brought on board were really all part of one original kind that God had created. He's still bringing on kinds that God had made. Now, here's some. Let's just hit some highlights from the paper. Some important pieces of text that I will certainly be using as quotes in the future. When we observe God's creatures, right here, plants and animals as we observe them today are not comprised of static species with invariant traits. Rather, they can change over time in certain ways. New variation can arise, as is well documented in domestic plants and animals. One only needs to look at breeds in livestock and varieties of garden plants, since the variety that has risen under domestication. If in domestic species, we do not generally identify new breeds and cultivars as separate species. However, then she goes on to point out that, all right, that's an easy place where you can see that like kinds are changing, right? There's a lot of different variation, and we can see those changes. But now she's going to talk about other changes that are seen in natural species and talk about the rate at which speciation happens. All right, so he's going to talk about these sticklebacks, how they have genetic variations that have gotten rid of, you move something to fresh water from salt water and they change their features. It has been assumed that these changes take thousands of years based on neo-Darwinian ideas and so forth. Of course, she believes things happen a lot faster, like young Earth creationists do. And then she makes this interesting point up here. See if I can remember where that is. However, these changes have been documented to occur rapidly within decades. This suggests that design pathways are involved. Moreover, the regulatory region affecting pelvic spines has stretches of thymine guanine, TG, repeats that make the region unstable. So she's identifying a genomic component of sticklebacks that has an unstable portion in its genome. The intact region presented in marine sticklebacks was shown to form alternative DNA structures, dramatically increasing the rate of double-stranded breaks and deletions. So there's this region, and because of the nature of the sequence in this particular region, there's a much higher rate of double-stranded breaks and repairs. Now, see, look at the word it uses. This design feature, in other words, God created these organisms with these stretches of DNA that are prone to breaking, right? Having many, many breaks and deletions and changes occurring there. And as a result, those changes help that organism adapt to a new environment and change its morphological characteristics in order to adapt and change in that environment and actually become new species. This design feature is consistent with an omniscient creator who created life ready and able to be able to reproduce and fill the earth. So in her view, filling the earth is you're going out and you're reproducing, but God has designed in these creatures places where they're going to have breaks and tears and changes and reorganizations. In other words, mutations, right? And you're going to have a lot of mutations, and those mutations are a design feature to allow the organism to explore new different conformations of their genetic information, allowing them to change and change quite rapidly. All right, so this isn't even necessarily genetic information they were actually given, as created things, but they actually gain this new genetic information through all these different mutations over time. So then she goes on, rapid changes have been observed in other organisms. There's a variety of different birds that have changed very quickly over time. So lots of things have changed really quickly. Now this is critical to her point because she's like, how much time does it take? Well, now she's trying to say, look, a lot of different changes have happened. It's important to recognize that under certain situations, organisms can diversify far more rapidly than scientists used to believe. Um, so big emphasis by young Earth creationists these days on rapid changes that can occur and rapid diversification into species. Because of course they need that because Ken Ham needs to have just 2 individuals giving rise to 35 species of canines, plus another 50 extinct species since the flood. So that's an enormous amount of change that has to be accommodated. But this is where, to me, it gets kind of fascinating, because I've often thought this, and I've been kind of waiting for the day that a young Earth creationist will really start to use this as a possible explanation. Based on the genealogies in Genesis 5, the time from the creation to the flood is around 1600 years. The estimates can vary a little depending on the textual tradition and so forth. In many cases, this is considerable time for diversification of plants and animals to occur. Several examples have been discussed in the previous section. In other words, look, I already just showed that it only takes 100 years to make like new species of sticklebacks. So if that's the case, and there was rapid changes and responses to a new environment, this is a commonly observed pattern, as God has designed his creatures to reproduce and fill the earth because he intends the earth to be inhabited. If the creation narrative implies, now this is important language here, so let me slow down. If the creation narrative, Genesis, implies that life was created in one area and was to reproduce and fill the new environmental niches, then diversification in the first few hundred years after creation should have been profound. This is similar to what young Earth creationists are basically saying about after the flood, right? You had all these animals on an ark, and the world was devoid of life, at least land-breathing animals, right, vertebrates. And then they departed from the ark. They all started from a small area. She's saying, what if you had Adam and Eve, the garden, and the surrounding area of Eden, and all the original created types were created in that area? And then what command were they given? Go out and fill the world, right? She takes from that, if they were supposed to go out and fill the world, the world wasn't filled already. God didn't just create a whole world that was already covered with all these different creatures of hundreds of thousands of individuals, but he created a few individuals, maybe 2, maybe 10, maybe 100 of each kind, but they were all local, and now they're going to have to diversify, and now they're going to have to move out across the face of the earth. And why wouldn't you expect them to rapidly diversify? Because they're going to move into different climates. They're different in higher elevations and different temperatures and so forth, and therefore they needed to be able to adapt. God gave them that ability, and so they then diversified greatly. After the flood, we all know the animals and flying creatures diversified from one location. Again, this is in this type of circumstance where rapid adaptation diversification led to be observed. Of course, it is also possible the environmental changes were too much for some organisms and they died out. This is another observable outcome when the environment profoundly changes. There's another thing I've often suggested to young Earth creationists that I have not really heard them take seriously, and that is maybe some organisms went extinct, maybe some kinds went extinct before the flood, rather than all being preserved on the ark. But young Earth creationists want to read extremely literally into God saying to Noah, you have to bring 2 of every kind. And since it's every kind, well, God created all the kinds. If he's saying every kind, then that means he has to bring everything that God created on board. But why isn't that just every kind that's still alive today? Like every kind that is still here. It could have been, after all, there was sin, right? And sin had these enormous consequences, right, to the world, for the young Earth creationists, to all the different animals. Why not extinction? Because clearly there's been extinction after the flood. Why couldn't there be extinction before the flood? And this would actually help them out a tiny little bit in terms of some of their fossil record issues. So the point here is that there's a whole bunch of time here, and you could expect diversification. And that diversification, the next 2 sections, she's going to go about like, hey, you had all this diversification and so forth. Okay, let's get right to the created kinds versus ark kinds. Again, I'm not going to go through all the biblical interpretation stuff here. I'm just going to say that I think she has a very reasonable point about all that. So what's her application? Right. She starts out, she says, in this created kinds versus ark kinds. It seems reasonable to infer that the kinds of Noah's day were similar to those at creation. Yeah, that's a reasonable thing. I mean, I'm not saying it's unreasonable for Ken Ham or others to read the text of Genesis 1 and Genesis 6 and think that the word kind there is referring to exactly the same organisms, and has a very like specific definition. It just feels like it does. As the language is similar, yeah, the Hebrew language is similar, although sometimes surrounded by different words in different contexts, right? So even though it's the same word, I and other creations often equate them, right? So yeah, like I in the past and other creationists, we often equate like kind there, kind there. Okay, those are the kinds God created there. I'm taking exactly the same representative of that exact kind on board the ark. However, is there a sound biblical basis to assume this? Probably not. All right, for reasons she's already given above. For several reasons. There were around 1,600 years between creation and the flood, based on the genealogy. In this time, some created kinds may have become extinct, while others could have diversified greatly. The kinds of animals Noah brought on the ark would have been the kinds recognizable to him, but not necessarily baramins in the taxonomic sense. Thus, some unclean baramins may have diversified enough that two from several distinct lineages were preserved. This allows for 2, 4, 6, or more descendants from a single baramin to be preserved. The fact that the wording of the Hebrew text allows for this possibility has implications for creation research. Heck yes, right? If, like I said before, if and it also has implications for like Ken Ham and his like there's X number of animals that were on the ark. Like he has like here's what the max number would have been because there were this many kinds. You only needed 2 of each of these, and so therefore the ark could easily fit them because there was only this many kinds. What she's saying here is you can't really even know how many as easily how many kinds there are on the ark. For one thing, you don't even really know how to define a kind from the created kind from the original, from the very beginning. And now you don't really know like how many kinds that sort of became in terms of what Noah would have observed. The kind of animals Noah would have been on the ark have been kinds recognizable to him. Right? This common language, this common appearance type of understanding of what a kind is. If several lineages from a single baramin were preserved on the ark, then it could have an unexpected signal in bareminological statistical analysis. Yeah, instead of having a bottleneck of 2 individuals, you could have the canine kind. There could have been 4 different couples of canines representing 4 different major groups of canines on the ark. All of them are part of the original kind, but they now represent 4 different major kinds or observable kinds alive at the time of Noah. And therefore, you're actually passing more genetic diversity through the flood. This would be hugely helpful for young creationists who have a genetic bottleneck problem to begin with. Now, she's actually alleviating part of that problem by saying you have more stuff on the ark. However, Ken Ham's also going to need to have like triple the number of total animals on the ark. And he can't just view like, okay, well, what was the original cat kind? What were the 2 cats like on the ark? Well, they must have been some amalgam of all the different species that are alive today because they all came from those 2 cats. But with Gene Leitner's view, it might have been obvious that there's lions, right? And there are, some kind of sand cat or something like that. Some cat that's more like your domesticated cat, a smaller cat, right? You get your big cats and you have your smaller cats, more lean and skinny cats, right? That might have been completely obvious at the time of Noah. And so what did Noah do? Like, was he supposed to bring in like 1 female lion and like some other little small cat to represent the diversity of 2 major lineages? No, in his natural world and natural understanding, just like you and I look at the world and we classify things when we look at things, and we can recognize the difference between like a lion and these other cats, right? Big cats and small cats. We just intuitively know there's a distinct difference between those two, and we would think of those as different kinds of things. And so Noah bring two different big cats and two different smaller cats on the ark, even though they share common ancestors. But they are kinds of things in his day. Lions gave rise to lions. Lions didn't bear house cats, right? That just nobody would have thought that or understood that. It's unreasonable to hold them to some sort of ultra scientific, strict literal analysis of what a kind is. This is the world they live in. All right, so Cunningham would need to seriously reconsider both the appearance of the organisms he has on the Ark Encounter and the total number of organisms he has on the Ark Encounter, if this is right, if Gene Leitner's analysis is right. And that's, so Gene Leitner is one of the people that originally sort of came up with the total numbers of kinds that are on the Ark, that are on the Ark, that Ken Ham talks about being on the Ark Encounter. And now she's written this paper, what, 8 or 9 years later, where it's like, this really feels like I've rethought this, and we're going to need a rethink. Maybe this is why it's published in the Journal of Creation and not in the Answers Research Journal. I don't know. Maybe it's very possible she sent it to the Answers Research Journal. They're like, I don't want any part of that, right? It sort of like undermines, other things that we have done. If several lineages from a single baramin are preserved on the ark, then it could give unexpected signal in bareminological statistical analysis. Yeah. A bit over a quarter of the Earth history is before the flood. If the baramin diversified greatly before the flood, resulting in several kinds at the time of Noah, and the lineages remained separate and continued to diversify after the flood, right? So the big cats and the little cats stayed separate after the ark, even though they're part of the same kind. Then they're going to have their own genetic lineages following back to a common ancestor. But that common ancestor actually comes from before the flood, not at the flood, which is the current general consensus of young Earth creationists. The flood was clearly a severe bottleneck in terrestrial and flying forms. I have attempted to distinguish created genetic diversity from mutation by recognizing a maximum of 4 alleles in any given unclean animal making it through the flood. The logic is that we are not told how individuals were created in each baramin in the beginning, but we are told how many made it through the flood, 2 of every unclean kind. If created kinds are not identical to ark kinds, then one needs to take this into consideration so correct inferences are not drawn. So incorrect inferences are not drawn. Now, in the specific case I used, there is still good reason to argue that there's several alleles from Almantia. Okay, I should say, like, for the unclean animals, which I skipped that whole section, if there were multiple different kinds by that time of Noah, then reading the text about the different specific, there are different kind of like sound like specific different kinds of unclean animals that are mentioned almost by species later in the Bible. And so she's saying, like, that they don't all have to trace themselves back to a common origin at Noah's flood. They could have come from a kind that's much farther back and already diversified by the time of the flood. We shouldn't be constricted to like forcing ourselves to define all the different diversity as having come from after the flood. And then there's this point here. Finally, one needs to exercise caution in using bareminological studies to identify the flood, post-flood boundary. Now here's where I wish I had a figure for this, so I'm going to have to use hand-wavy type things. Some of you may know, if you've made it this far in the video, you probably do know, that there are 2 major interpretations of where the flood boundary is, meaning where does all the rock that was laid down in the flood, where does that end, and where does post-flood rock begin, like things that happen after the flood. Things that happened after the flood would include fossils in them that came from descendants of individuals that got off the ark. And there's been a raging debate about like, where is that demarcation line? Is it all the way back at the Cretaceous Paleogene boundary, 66 million years ago in conventional dating? If that's the case, and one of the main arguments for that Answers in Genesis uses is they look at things like the canines, and they look at like the fossil record of canines or cats or primates or one of it, really almost any mammalian group, a mammalian family. And you look at the fossil record. The fossil record goes back 30 or 40 million years for some of those groups. And so what they would say is like, oh, there was only, canines represent a kind. So, and they only are found in like the last 30 or 40 million years. And so all that diversity seems to come from a few individuals and becomes lots and lots of different diversity. And we see it all after some point. So the flood the flood boundary must be below that. And it has to be below that because there were only two canines on the ark. Those two canines got off the ark, and then they became all the different canines that are present today. And they've been preserved in the post-flood record in the last 4,000 years. And so their assumption of a common ancestor that was on the ark leads them to push the flood boundary really low in the rock record, in the geological column. What Gene Leitner is saying here is, look, if there was a fox type and a wolf type and a something else type of canine that were all on the ark, you could have the post-flood boundary be much higher, because then the flood itself could have preserved some of those different diversified members of the original kind into those different subkinds, and they would have been present before the flood. And then they got preserved, but the reason you see their fossils below the flood boundary and above it is because Noah preserved each of those major lines through the flood, and then they just kept on going after the flood. And that's why you see their fossils on both sides of the flood boundary line. The flood boundary line has been used by AIG specifically to reject the ICR, Institute for Creation Research, really high limit. And the fact that they believe that only the very little tiny layer of rock on the face of the earth is actually from the post-flood world. But their problem has always been most of the fossils of kinds that they think are kinds, there's many, many, many species that are found much deeper in the fossil record. So how could all those species be present before the flood, but not be preserved on the ark and only have two members on the ark, and then somehow become all those same species again and show up again on the fossil record? That seems like an absolutely impossible thing to get to argue. Except Gene Leitner came and provided them with an explanation. You could take from this maybe canines, or let's say primates for Ken Ham. Maybe primates had already diversified. Maybe great apes had already diversified from an original great ape into gorillas, orangutans, and what's the other one? The chimpanzees, of course. Maybe they'd already diversified into those three major types of great apes. And so each one of those ended up being part of the fossil record because they were destroyed in the flood. But Noah had preserved two chimpanzees, two gorillas, and two orangutans on the ark. And then they left the ark, and now that's why they're present today still. And their fossil record goes farther down in the fossil record than, like, say, ICR would accept. And so they diversified before the flood, and Noah preserved them as three kinds of things. And that's why today they also are three kinds, right? They're three very distinct types of organisms that, once again, I'll say, like, I think anybody in the world just using common sense will say that those are different kinds of things, right? Orangutans have orangutan offspring, and they don't associate with gorillas, right? They're different kinds of organisms. And so Gene Leitner is providing, by this analysis, suggesting that it's not required in the biblical text that an ark kind, the mean that Noah brought on board is not the same, doesn't have to be the same as the thing that God created. But she is like, the cat's out of the bag now, because like, not only has she not provided a strict definition for how to identify what a kind is exactly, she's made it even harder, right? It's now like, what was the original kind? It could be super broad. Like I say, it could be carnivores. It could be not even the ungulates. It could be ruminants, like all ruminants. It could be all bats, right? Are all just one kind. But by the time the flood arrived, there was 15 different major lineages of bats, right? There were fruit bats and there were insect-eating bats. And so each one of those kinds was preserved on the ark for us. But that also means that kinds since the ark could have diversified enough that they've become even more kinds today. So kinds can beget kinds, and kinds can then beget more kinds. And all this is just like saying one kind can become different enough from another kind, or one kind can generate enough diversity and differences that they produce offspring eventually that are all unique organisms that give rise to similar organisms that are different from others. And so therefore we recognize them as new kinds. This is just a phylogenetic tree. I mean, this is just common ancestry, descent with modification, new kinds form over time. Those things then continue to descend with modification, and eventually there's new kinds from those. And so in this model, you have an original kind, created more kinds, some of those kinds are preserved on the ark, and then since then, more kinds have been formed. So what's the limit? I'm sure Gene Leiter believes that there is a limit, and that there is distinction between ultimate kinds. But how do we know what those ultimate kinds were? That is going to be very difficult to tell, and that's where the squabbles and debates come in with the young earth creationists. Some of them are like, you have to use exclusively the Bible to tell that difference. Some of it's like all about reproductive ability, but that's really messy because of mutations and other things that happen. So there are very similar species that can't mate with each other, but they still want to say they're part of the same kind. And so there's excuses made, which I think are reasonable excuses to be made, but nonetheless, it's hard to define. And then others have like a statistical way of analysis, like a bunch of different characteristics and doing some kind of stats on it to give you some kind of like distinction between different groups and call those different kinds. But then you're just capturing today's variation, like what did that look like if you went 2,000 years ago? What would that statistical analysis have looked like? It's all really, really hard. And the thing is, almost everything else about creation biology kind of hinges on like actually knowing what a kind is in order to develop a model to explain how those kinds have the features that they have. And so it's a really tough nut to crack. But I appreciate this particular article. This article was really, really interesting from somebody who's geeky on this stuff and really kind of like thinks about the ramifications of some of the creationist ideas. Once again, I think that I haven't called Jean Leitner, haven't really ever put her in the camp of what I call the new creationist. But maybe I should, because she has all the different kinds of characteristics that I think of as the new creationist, and that is she's willing to, she's very open in exploring ideas. She applies really good logic to her analysis. She's willing to buck the trend, and she does it. I mean, she's actually, I think, actually overthrowing some of her past stuff. And so I think this is a really good thing for young earth creationists to have these types of articles here. So I'll be interested to see what the long-term ramifications of this are, but I wouldn't be surprised if she's going to get lumped in with Ken Ham when he's like identifying who these heretics are within his midst, like people that are opening up the door to too much evolution, that are influenced by evolution. Because I could read this article, as I kind of have, as trying to like almost acknowledging like, Yeah, there's lots of evidence that organisms can change and they become different sorts of types of organisms, become, you know, distinct from one another, so much so that we identify them as being different kinds. Well, Cunningham could look at that and say, you're just like, you've fallen prey to evolutionary thought, right? You're thinking like an evolutionist. You've been trapped by their. I don't think Leitner at all is thinks of herself as like trying to accommodate evolutionary theory at all. But Cunningham could look at an article like this and think that they're under the influence of evolutionary biology and therefore call them a young Earth evolutionist. And by labeling them that way, basically telling the community, stay away, don't look at stuff like this because it's tainted work. Um, Now, all right, that's all my machinations about Gene Leitner's created kinds versus art kinds and the implications for creation research. I will say that this very well could be a significant paper going forward. I look forward to seeing who references it and who kind of avoids referencing it, because that's going to tell me a lot about individuals' willingness to grapple with these hard questions about what a kind is from a young Earth creationist perspective. All right, I'm quitting there. Thanks for listening. Talk to you later. Bye bye.